In the mid-2000s, Game Freak was tasked with launching the 4th generation of their flagship IP. And despite the resounding success of Fire Red and Leaf Green, which I discussed in my previous retrospective, they were still remakes of existing games at the end of the day, and the fans' appetite for original content certainly wasn't waning. In other words, the pressure was on to deliver another pair of titles complete with a brand new region and roster of creatures. And what they came up with in the early autumn of 2006 ultimately proved to be among the most iconic entries in the entire franchise. Pokémon Diamond and Pearl. Of course, with a new generation comes a new console, and the appointed vessel for Gen 4 was the ever-celebrated Nintendo DS. The acronym DS is actually misconstrued quite commonly to mean dual screen, because it comes to our evolutionary advantage as a species to perceive objects in reality and label them with respect to their characteristics. I would like to tell you what it really stands for, but I think I'll abstain lest I succumb to my own primal urges to share things that I discover about the world around me. All I know is that 2 screens are definitely better than 1 probably, and this sucker has a glorious pair if I've ever seen one. There's much more real estate for that sweet unreal-time combat on the top screen now, and look at all the things you can do with the Poke Edge. Jesus, you could run iOS on this thing. But perhaps the most critical feature of the second display was the touchscreen functionality, which I had a lot of fun revisiting for this video on my Nintendo DS. The way they incorporated it into the contests is honestly really cool, and actually, the contests in general are really cool. And also all of the other 4 adjectives. What used to be mere contests in the last generation are now super contests, complete with a whole new training paradigm in the form of the Poffin system, as well as a structural overhaul of the events themselves. The performances are now carried out over 3 stages: visual, dance, and acting. The acting stage is the most similar to what we're familiar with from the Hoenn games, barring a slight twist from the voltage system, but the first 2 stages are entirely unique. Players are able to test their aesthetic mettle by adorning their Pokemon with various accessories, and then break it down on the dance floor in a remarkably enjoyable rhythmic minigame. But let's be honest, the touch sensitivity is far from the most earth-shattering development the DS brought to the table. Besides the fact that you can literally shatter the earth by going underground in these games, Generation 4 marked the first time that Pokemon trainers around the world could connect to the internet. Leading up to the release of Diamond and Pearl, there was much discourse surrounding the prospect of players being able to battle and trade with others around the globe. And Game Freak ingeniously delivered on these implicit demands by setting up an international system of signals through fiber optic cables, as well as wireless networks of electromagnetic waves. It seems like Game Freak has a habit of changing the world every decade. In 1996, they invented the highest grossing media franchise of all time. In 2006, they invented Wi-Fi at the request of a particularly speculative Cerebi user. And in 2016, they invented Rowlet, which is a very cute fictional bird. I guess we're due for another one here in a minute, eh? Now, there is one more major innovation introduced in Gen 4 that I have yet to touch on, and that is the physical special split. Honestly, depending on who you ask, this is arguably the most significant gameplay enhancement that came with this generation. I mean, yeah, the internet's a pretty big deal. A lot of people like to use Fandango, and this picture of Mercury on Google Images is pretty cool. But the physical special split effectively sparked a revolution of combat viability and permanently changed the dynamic of Pokemon movesets for the better. You see, up until this point, the damage category of an offensive move was entirely determined by its type. Normal fighting, flying, poison, ground, rock, bug, ghost, and steel moves were all physical attacks, whereas water, electric, fire, psychic, dark, grass, ice, and dragon moves were all special attacks. And in the parallel universe where the fairy type was introduced 3 generations earlier and Toxtricity was actually named Electroisin, it's likely that fairy would have been a special type as well. Which kinda makes me wonder. Aggressive speculation aside, the simplicity of this categorization method, while elegant and conveniently predictable, was more of a limitation which ultimately undermined the nuances of the stat distributions that come with such a vast and diverse Pokédex. Take Hitmonchan for example. The Pokédex labels Hitmonchan as the punching Pokémon, and it fittingly has high physical attack and low special attack. However, one of the cool things about Hitmonchan is that it can have so much offensive type coverage by learning the elemental punches, those being Fire Punch, Ice Punch, and Thunder Punch. The problem is that these are Fire, Ice, and Electric type moves respectively, so before Gen 4, they were relegated to the special category, which inauspiciously corresponds to Hitmonchan's weakest stat. But after the physical special split, the damage category of an attack was no longer determined by its type, but instead by how it would actually be performed according to its its flavor text. So for Generation 4 and beyond, something like Fire Punch is a physical attack regardless of its type, because it makes sense logistically. The name Fire Punch implies that the Pokemon is making physical contact with their fist, and this is fortuitous for Hitmonchan because physical attack is its highest stat. In fact, a Pokemon like Kingler benefited even more from the split because its high physical attack and low special attack were not only incompatible with its signature move Crabhammer, but also its own water typing. Now that Crabhammer is physical, Kingler can use it without reservation and capitalize on the same type attack bonus. Not only does this allow for more compelling engagement from previously compromised Pokemon, but it also makes the battles feel more intuitive as a whole. I mean, it feels silly for a move described as whacking your opponent with a crab claw not to be a physical attack just because it's associated with water. This is just one of those changes to the formula that seems to be unanimously praised by the fans, and rightfully so. It may be a win-win situation for the player, but it took a lot of extra work on Game Freak's end to make it happen. They had to sit down and categorize each individual attack based on its description, and also commit to doing the same for every move that they would come up with in the future. I think it's awesome that they put in the effort to implement such a massively advantageous, yet candidly non-vital modification so as to make the primary mode of progression in these games that much more optimal. But stats are for nerds. Where are my world builders out there?
Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum provide the unique experience of traveling through the Sinnoh region. Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum provide the unique pleasure of traveling through the Sinnoh region.
Sinnoh lives up to the standard of previous regions with its own selection of visually wondrous locations, including the Valley Windworks, Fuego Ironworks, Iron Island, the Old Chateau, a healthy heaping of snowy terrain, and a gigantic-ass mountain that tears its way through the central meridian. And as you make your way through this beautifully diverse region, your adventure is complemented by an equally beautiful score. Over the progression of Nintendo's handheld consoles, the sound chips were only getting better, and the breadth of timbres this time around was wider than ever before. But more importantly, this added horizontal complexity also came with more vertical complexity in the compositional sense. Diamond and Pearl's music particularly exhibits harmonic sophistication with its uniquely jazz-inspired tertian extensions, as well as dynamic sophistication with tastefully consistent crescendos and decrescendos, both of which are showcased in this track near the beginning of the player's journey. They really went above and beyond with this soundtrack, even to the point of subtly altering the music for a given area depending on the time of day.
Yep, you heard that right. The day-night cycle is back, baby, and it's here to stay this time. Also, say it with me one more time for the road, everybody. Thank Christ there's more bag space!
You know, I mentioned in the opening paragraph how Diamond and Pearl were among the most iconic games in the series, and I could belabor all the gory details as to why that's the case. In fact, I'm doing so right now, but I honestly think it just comes down to the fact that these titles managed to take the sliders on the mixing board that is Pokemon, both good and bad, and push all of them to 11. I'm planning to expound on this in a couple of future retrospectives, but Generation 4 marks the end of an era in many ways, and its bombastic nature is fitting given its place as the finale of the first phase of this franchise, so to speak. The way I see it, Diamond and Pearl's tendency to capture the extreme ends of the spectrum manifests in three aspects: the Pokédex, the world, and the story. Sinnoh's regional Pokédex contains several of the most well-known and admired Pokemon in Game Freak's illustrious bestiary. The starters work incredibly well as a trio, particularly in their final stages. I mean, the Piplup fanbase is probably substantial enough to constitute an LLC on its own, but seriously, in terms of design, this is my favorite set of fully evolved starters. The ones from Hoenn are a close second, though. I just think it's really cool how each of them has a secondary typing which helps them against the starter they're supposed to be weak to. And as a lifelong Dragon Ball fan, I suppose one of my most predictable opinions is that Infernape used to be my favorite Pokemon of all time.
My current favorite of all time is Kricketune, which is another Pokemon from this region.
Actually, you know what? Let's just take a look at Route 204 for a second. Let's just take a quick hop, skip, and a jump over to Route 204.
Why am I bringing up a single random area in the early game whose name doesn't even have a proper noun in it? I'll tell you why. It's because it is a scientific marvel how stacked this region's roster is.
Available Pokemon on Route 204 include Starly, Bidoof, Kricketot, Shinx, Budew. There's more than that, but I'm not going to continue because I've run out of slots in my party. All of these guys are long-term team material, and they're available before the first gym badge.
I schlepped these bitches all the way to the Elite Four.
Pokemon like Lucario, Lopunny, and Garchomp have basically reached celebrity status at this point due to their, shall we say, smashing qualities. I mean, Lucario is in Smash, Lopunny is the third most smashable Pokemon character, and Garchomp is the ace of Champion Cynthia. the second most smashable Pokemon character. Pachirisu had its 15 minutes of fame after being on the World Champions team in 2014, and Rotom is a refrigerator that's also a microwaving, clothes-washing, lawn-mowing fan, which basically makes it your average Samsung fridge with almost as many features.
So, if Sinnoh's Pokedex truly is as stacked as I say it is, then why did I say in my Gen 2 retrospective that Johto's roster had the best designs? Well, this goes back to Diamond and Pearl's habit of capturing both the good and bad ends of the spectrum, because it turns out that Sinnoh, Sinnoh's got a lot of uggos.
This regional Pokedex is quite frankly home to several of the most visually unappealing and frumpy critters in the series. Some of these designs are just so overcooked, and I would argue that a large contributor to that is the fact that one of the main themes of Sinnoh's roster, if not the primary one, is evolutionary continuations of existing Pokemon. In fact, they make up more than a quarter of the entire group. Now, this isn't actually a bad thing on the whole because it helped out quite a few previously underpowered Pokemon by giving them evolutions, which was sorely needed for Johto especially, and well, mostly Johto. But if we're being real, some of these guys really didn't need new forms. Oh dear, Rhydon, what did they do to you? Somehow, the shorter tongue is even worse. Chingling, buddy, what are you doing here? Do your parents know where you are? Oh my god, it's another baby form. Why does this child have a child? Okay, Apom actually did need a new form, but I thought we discussed that it was with the express understanding that he not go to Great Clips for a haircut.
Also, quick sidebar, do you remember in the first couple generations when there were only 5 or 6 legendaries in each region? Remember how that made them feel more special and actually live up to their legendary status? Yeah, about that.
Anyway, going back to the new forms, despite how much I just complained about a few of them, I would estimate that their focus on evolutions of previously introduced Pokemon is still a net positive. I mean, some of these guys are freaking awesome. Roserade, Gallimus, Magus, Togekiss, Honchkrow, Magnezone, Bonsly, Mantine, Weavile, Electivire, Leafeon, Glaceon, Gliscor, Dusknoir, Probopass, Frostlass. These two don't fit the rhyme scheme, but they are extremely cool and rad.
Sucks for you though, because more than half of them aren't even available until after you beat the frickin' game.
Diamond and Pearl's Pokedex has a glaring accessibility problem. In fact, if you didn't choose Chimchar, you'd better hope you can find a Ponyta, because otherwise you're not getting a fire type.
You see what I mean about these games taking big risks and shooting for the fences? With high risk comes high reward, but also potentially steep deficits. And another component which exemplifies this effect quite explicitly is the world.
The Sinnoh region's diversity and rich selection of biomes are unmatched compared to its predecessors, and the player's navigation therein involves correspondingly diverse modes of interaction, whether it be slicing trees, clearing fog, pushing boulders, breaking boulders, tackling berries, scaling walls, scaling waterfalls. Now this is all fine and good in theory because it makes you feel like an adventurer having to traverse the overworld in creative ways, but in practice, it actually becomes quite cumbersome the further you progress because each one of those HMs takes up a move slot. And these games have so many more HM requirements than the previous titles that I had to visit the old Move Deleter and Reminder Duo several times, even with my emotional support Barrel.
But by far the most apt example of how Diamond and Pearl shoot for the moon and only hit the dark side is the story. This is handedly the most ambitious, cinematic, mythological, self-important, cookie-cutter plot that I've discussed in these videos so far.
I briefly touched on this phenomenon with Team Aqua and Magma in my Hoenn retrospective, but I consider Cyrus and Team Galactic to be the poster children of raising the stakes without raising the personal urgency. They went through the trouble of expanding the lore and introducing all of these primordial deities, presenting these reality-rending cutscenes of eye candy, but it ultimately rings hollow for me because they're all developed through the lens of Cyrus's nonsensical goals and motivations.
Cyrus's goals and motivations are so nonsensical. One of the trainers working for Team Galactic openly admits that even he doesn't know what the hell he's trying to achieve exactly.
It's a real shame because all of the creation myths and divine history behind the legendaries are some of the most entertaining nuggets of world building in the franchise. But most of their substantive potential is squandered by the pretentiously articulated conflict that surrounds them. The cosmic scale of Diamond and Pearl's story promotes superficial spectacle rather than emotional resonance. With that being said, I'm happy to say that one of the elements of the story that actually works quite well for me is the characters. As satisfying as it is to tackle Barry when he's being annoying, I have to concede that he has much more personality than your rival in the Hoenn games. The character dialogue, including some of the random NPCs, is funny as always, if not more so, and I also just just love the designs of the prominent trainers in the campaign, such as the Elite Four members, the Team Galactic admins, and Professor Rowan, the most smashable Pokemon character.
Well, we've reached the point in the retrospective where I finally talk about the third enhanced version. But I'm afraid this will be the final time.
That's right, Pokemon Platinum was the last single enhanced edition in the series, and I don't foresee Game Freak ever returning to this release paradigm. The good news is that they really finished strong with this one, because I would confidently assert that the improvement from Diamond and Pearl to Platinum is undeniably the biggest improvement out of any of the enhanced versions over their original counterparts. Virtually all of the mechanical flaws with Diamond and Pearl are entirely addressed and elegantly resolved, and there's a generous helping of additional content, both before and after the main story concludes. Remember the whole Pokédex accessibility problem I was whining about earlier? Yep, that's been mostly remedied. Diamond and Pearl also has quite a notorious pacing issue, and Platinum fixed that too by quickening the sluggish overworld movement as well as the infamously slow health bars in battle. Speaking of the overworld, Platinum added a few patches of snow around the region, which serves to bolster the resemblance between Sinnoh and its real-life inspiration Hokkaido, the northernmost main island of Japan.
And if you've ever visited Hokkaido, you'll know about the spooky purple shadow dimension that also makes an appearance during the story's climax. My jokes used to be funny.
In all seriousness, the Distortion World is quite possibly the coolest set piece in all of Pokemon, especially with the wacky gravity shenanigans. I love all the water features and chunks of earthy terrain phasing in and out of sight. It gives the impression that this isn't just a random spacey parallel universe. Giratina is the god of antimatter, so it makes sense that its domain is an unstable, warped image of inverted reality. I have to say that the new members of the cast are a welcome addition to the plot. Looker is a perpetual delight, and the stat trainers they added to some of the denser areas were very nice to have around. All 5 of them have great designs, and the new Frontier Brains look amazing to boot. Now, there is one change they made for Platinum version that isn't necessarily considered an undisputed improvement by the fans, and that is the way you get your starter Pokemon. In Diamond and Pearl, Barry takes the player to Lake Verity to see if you can catch a glimpse of the red Gyarados that was headlining the news, and you notice that Professor Rowan left his briefcase in the tall grass. When you go to investigate, a duo of wild Starly attacks from the grass, and both of you are forced to choose a partner from the starters in the briefcase. When you bring it back to the professor, he lets you keep whichever starter you chose and sends you on an adventure like always. In Pokemon Platinum, instead of going to Verity Lakefront, Barry takes you to the tall grass immediately outside of Twin Leaf Town and convinces you to try and run across to get to Professor Rowan's lab in Sandgem Town, but the professor catches you in the act before any wild Pokemon can attack you in the first place. He asks you why you would make such a foolish series of decisions, and Barry admits to the whole thing being his idea, after which point he agrees to giving you a starter Pokemon and sends you off on your journey. I can see why this change might be deflating for some people, since it's not as exciting or cinematic, and that's totally valid. I've been known to be wrong about some things too.
I keep telling you and you keep not listening. Pokemon Platinum is better than Diamond and Pearl in every conceivable way.
There are a couple reasons why I like the second version of events more. First of all, Barry defends the player by confessing that it was his idea to take the reckless shortcut, which conveys an interesting integrity to his character, both to you and the professor. Second of all, the reason he wanted to take the shortcut in the first place was so he could get to the research lab to learn more about Pokemon, which clues Professor Rowan into how passionate and invested he and the player are, and gives him a level of humanity beyond his stern exterior. It's honestly a great scene that sets the stage beautifully for the dawn of a new journey. Speaking of Dawn, am I allowed to admit publicly that I had a crush on Dawn as a kid? Because I think I just admitted publicly that I had a crush on Dawn as a kid. Nonetheless, the anime series for Generation 4 was incredible for no reason. A lot of people will have you believe that Ash Ketchum from X and Y is the best version of the character, and they would be correct. But if you ask me, this is the coolest version of Ash. First of all, this is easily his best outfit, and no one can tell me otherwise. Second of all, the squad that he ends up building for the Sinnoh League is by far my favorite out of any of the teams he's ever constructed in the show. He had 2 fully evolved starters, one of the best early bird Pokemon in the franchise, 2 of the best designed Pokemon in the franchise in terms of combining coolness and cuteness, and of course his trusty Pikachu. Now, the interesting thing about Ash's Buizel is that it suffers from an affliction I like to call the Embor effect. I promise my metaphors are usually more categorically adventurous. Embor is a Pokemon who ultimately got the short end of the stick, so to speak. But in retrospect, it wasn't entirely its fault. You see, a lot of Pokemon fans harbor resentment against Embor due to it being a fire and fighting type. And this doesn't seem like a bad thing until you realize that the fire starter before it was also a fighting type. And the fire starter before that was also a fighting type. So while it doesn't help that Embor's design is quite divisive on its own, it also became an easy target toward which people could concentrate their frustration about Game Freak making 3 firefighting starters in a row. And analogously, while it doesn't help that Ash is constantly criticized for not evolving his Pokemon in general, Buizel became an easy target because he didn't evolve his main water type in any of the previous series either, nor the next one for what it's worth. I recognize that I'm coming into this debate with a significant bias because of my adoration for Buizel's design, which even exceeds that of its evolution, but I personally love the fact that he never evolves, and I love Ash's tendency not to evolve his Pokemon in most cases, for that matter. Whenever I would talk about the anime with my friends as a kid, I noticed that for some reason they had this idea that the show would somehow improve if Ash were a more quote-unquote competent trainer who always evolved his Pokemon and actually won the Pokemon League for a change. And even back then, I never understood this sentiment. To me, the thing that made Ash special was his commitment to doing whatever was best for his Pokemon and their desires, regardless of whether it was strategically lucrative. Whenever he won an important battle, it felt like a glorious upset because of that, and whenever he lost, well, yep, that checks out. Ash makes mistakes. He's reckless, he's dramatic, he's impulsive, and he's hopelessly human. And you know what? If Ash wasn't so tuned into his Pokemon's needs and desires, he wouldn't even have Buizel in the first place. Buizel was originally Dawn's Pokemon, but he traded his Aipom for him because they recognized that Aipom enjoyed contests more than fighting, whereas Buizel enjoyed battles more than performing with Dawn.
Honestly, the more I thought about this edgy fanfiction version of Ash, who always evolves his Pokemon and optimizes his strategies for the Pokemon League that people would always pine for, the more I realized that this platonic ideal of a Pokemon trainer already exists in the show.
And that character's name is Paul. Paul is Ash's rival throughout the Diamond and Pearl series of the anime, and he does not mess around. Everything that people make fun of Ash for failing to do, Paul does in spades. Not only does he always evolve his Pokemon, but he also optimizes their utility by exploiting their strengths and weaknesses, always navigating a given scenario with a sharp analyst's eye. He felt like a serious step up from Ash's previous rivals. I mean, Gary was extremely talented, sure, but the show's conveyance of that was always cartoonish and almost disarming. But there is nothing disarming or cartoonish about Paul. The only thing Paul exudes when he's on the screen is cold, unadulterated skill. But there is one thing Paul fails to do, and that's treating Pokemon with respect. There are multiple scenes in which Paul openly insults his recently captured Pokemon and releases them on account of their power level falling below his standard. And one of these Pokemon is Chimchar. Ash witnesses this abandonment and takes it upon himself to bring Chimchar under his wing, with whom he would eventually evolve into Infernape and become one of Ash's most powerful allies. There's a reason why the quarterfinal match between Ash and Paul at the Lily of the Valley Conference is considered by so many to be the greatest battle in the entire franchise. Not only do we get to see the contrast between Paul's orchestrated style of strategy and Ash's improvisational style of thinking outside the box, but we also get the intense shared desire of Ash and his Infernape to prove Paul wrong and show everyone that they're worthy battlers.
This video is supposed to be about a video game.
So, what do you think? Did Game Freak jump the shark with the cosmic scale of Diamond and Pearl's plot, or was it just the right amount of escalation? For me personally, I'm not a huge fan of the story in the Sinnoh games, and Diamond and Pearl certainly have their fair share of issues, but if we're being real, most of them were fixed just a couple years later.
And now that I've finished 5 of these retrospective videos, I have to say I feel pretty darn great about where we're headed, because the way I see it, the release of Pokemon Platinum in 2008 marks the beginning of the golden age of Pokemon.